For those of you who don't know, my name is Mary. I know a lot of you know me in real life, so this is like low-key kind of weird. Hi. Thanks for watching. Don't acknowledge that I'm doing this. I've not made any type of videos like this before, but I've wanted to do this for a while. I wanted to kind of share my story, my journey of how I went from being like an atheist / agnostic to Muslim. I converted about 2.5 years ago. I guess officially converted about 2.5 years ago. I was raised kind of, I guess, Christian, sort of. My dad, he was raised Catholic. He's a Christian, I would say, though. He doesn't say, he says he's not a believer, he's a knower, which I think is really cute, and I love that. Growing up, my parents didn't want to enforce any particular like belief system or like shove it down our throats, you know, which I really value. I think it's very, very important to choose your beliefs, because I don't think, I mean, like, it's in Islam, that's one of the things I love about it, is there's no compulsion in religion. So I have mixed feelings about that. Raising your kids in not any particular religion, wanting them to choose for themselves, I think is really, really valuable, and I really respect and value my parents for doing that, because, like, here I am now, right, and they've been really supportive. Alhamdulillah, honestly, because I know a lot of people don't have that luxury. There were some struggles with it, like having all these questions and just like that existential dread that I think like we all have had or will have at some point in our lives. That was a little bit more challenging to deal with when you don't have a particular line of faith that you follow. And largely, honestly, I was raised like in a family of scientists, basically. So generally speaking, it's like, if it wasn't a reproducible like experiment that you could see in your physical reality, you're kind of like stupid to think otherwise. Not that my family's super judgmental or anything like that. Like I said, my dad's Christian, and my mom's kind of more like non-practicing of anything in particular. I would say maybe mostly like my brothers. My brothers are super, super, super brilliant, mashallah, all of them. And one of them is a physicist, and he's definitely on the like, if A, then B, then C, like there's no question, you know, just go with pure logic. And so he was a huge influence on my life. We were very close growing up. So honestly, I had a very strong interest in philosophy and in religion. I still do. I've had it, gosh, I've been interested in those topics since I was, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11. And in terms of Islam, when that came into my life, it was mostly, honestly, because of one of my very, very, very best friends, who I'm still best friends with today. I met her when I was 9. We went to the same homeschool group, which, side note, don't ever homeschool your children. That's a whole other story, unless you really know what you're doing and it's like putting all the time and effort. But like, honestly, that's a whole other thing. I don't want to be controversial, no judgment if you are someone who does homeschool your children. But anyways, so her and I are still really close, and honestly, I didn't know what Islam was until, gosh, I was like 11 or 12 maybe. It wasn't until one day I wanted an excuse to call her, and I was like, oh, it's Christmas, I want to say Merry Christmas to her. So I called her, I was like, Merry Christmas, you know, whatever, this and that thing, what are you guys doing? And she said, oh, we actually don't celebrate Christmas. And I was like, what do you mean? Who doesn't celebrate Christmas? I was like, are you Jewish? That's like, I didn't really know much about Judaism either. No, she was like, oh, I'm Muslim. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So she was someone honestly, who really, really exemplifies the characteristics, optimism, and just like who she is as a person. Honestly, like one of the best people I've ever met in my entire life, honestly, like completely objectively speaking. Well, she's gonna yell at me if or when she sees this, whatever. But yeah, so she's the one who kind of caught my attention in terms of setting the stage of like what Islam is. And she was never preachy about about it. That's one thing. She was never preachy. She was never pushy. She wouldn't even necessarily really talk to me about it because she did not want to be pushy. So I would always come to her with questions, and we'd talk about things. And then in high school, I had another best friend, and again, he's like one of the best people I've ever met in my life. In terms of just his character and his integrity, and just like, he had so many hardships in his life, and he just fared them so beautifully, so beautifully. He's just like an outstanding person. And yeah, so I mean, and he also, we didn't really necessarily talk about Islam too much. I would ask him here and there about things, and he would share little tidbits. But in general, it was just like his character just showed. So I had, growing up, having my first best friend, the girl, and then the second best friend in high school, the boy. I was very protective of the religion, because it was just shown to me by these two really beautiful people, like just how beautiful religion it was. And I remember, like, in high school, like, people would make like terrorist jokes and just stupid stuff like that, and I would get all ticked. I'd get more ticked than he would, honestly. Then in college, funnily enough, the next person that I guess was the biggest influence on me was my college professor. He was a history professor. He's actually an atheist. So he was a huge part of my like conversion too, which is super funny. But he knew Arabic, and he knew Hebrew, and I think Aramaic. He was fluent in all of those things. Super, super, super cool dude, mashallah. He lived in the Middle East, I don't know where, for a couple years, and he had translated the Quran, like, by himself, like, line by line by line, by himself. So he had a really thorough understanding of it, and he obviously was a history professor, so he knew all the history of, like, different things. And it was just, I remember thinking, like, okay, this was right around the time where I had, like, this really deep, like, existential crisis. I call it, like, I was a non-consensual atheist, because it was one of those things, like, I didn't necessarily want to believe in atheism because I was this, like, angry edgelord of just, like, oh, how could God this? I've never, like, honestly, like, been, like, angry at God or whatever. I know a lot of people have had that experience, which is, like, I don't want to, like, detract from that or anything, but that was just not my experience. I was very much held up on logic and, like, what makes sense. In this class with my history professor, my atheist history professor, he would talk about, like, the etymology of different words, and I remember one of them specifically was sin, and because I was like, that doesn't make sense to me, like, this God that's all-powerful and all-loving and all these different things that I had learned from, like, just general Christianity and stuff, like, on the internet, would be angry at you and curse you to hell for, like, sinning. It didn't make sense. Like, things that, like, why would that upset God? Like, this all-knowing, all-powerful creator, why would he be personally affected by you doing something that would harm you, right? And so, and I don't know if this is actually the case, I would assume, because he knows what he's talking about, my history professor. He was talking about how sin came from the word san, or sans, which is without. And so his logic, or what he was saying, was basically like, historically, back in the day, I don't think he was even talking about Islam at this point, but sins, it's like the biggest source of suffering is to be without God, right? So when you do these sins, they take you further from God. And so basically hell is to be like without God. And I'm like, that's really interesting. And so, and I remember my I guess oldest best friend, the girl, she once told me, I asked her, I think at this time I was like, how, because she's a scientist, she's like literally a scientist. And I asked her, I was like, how can you like believe in these things? Like what got you to it? Like, was it because you were raised in it? And she said it wasn't so much that at all. She wanted to go to like the purest form of like truth, essentially. She said that based off of pure logic and rationality, like it made sense. And I was like, that's interesting. And so that kind of just, those two things like really stuck with me. So over time, I guess in the age of like 20, I had a bunch of other experiences that were very like personal like spiritual in nature. That took me from like pure like, okay, it's illogical to think that anything happens after you die, to, okay, there are too many coincidences all at once for this to be like merely coincidence. And so I was like, okay, so there has to be like something, right? So then I was like more in touch with like just like general spirituality without any specific religion attached to it. In Islam, everything that's prescribed to you is for your own good. You know, it's for you. And so I would do this thing where if I learned something that kind of matched with Islam, I would send it to the girl best friend and be like, hey, this makes sense. So like, for example, in Ramadan, you know, you're supposed to fast for like 30 days, right? And I was reading up all these benefits on like intermittent fasting and fasting in general, and I was like, oh wow, like it has all of these insane health benefits. And I would like be like, hey, look, the Muslims are right again, you know? And I would always do that. It just kind of, it wasn't one of those things where I was like, oh, here is a religion, I am now that religion. That would not have worked with me. I acquired all these different beliefs separately over time. I also always believed like that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was like a prophet, right? I guess securing the belief of like, okay, it doesn't make sense to me that like Jesus is a person, but then he's also God, but then there's one God, but then like, so like that, a lot of like the Christian logic didn't really make sense to me. I think a lot of these prophets are legitimate like prophets, like they're all saying the same thing. Like they're not in a group text together, right? They're not connected, but they're all saying the same thing. So in that regard, like meeting like the minimum requirements of like what makes you a Muslim, I've probably been a Muslim for like many years, but it wasn't until, weirdly enough, super weird, so many like weird little things that are just like completely small, it kind of led me to like the conclusion of like, oh wow, like I think I'm a Muslim, right? It wasn't until I was actually talking with a really good friend of mine. She's Christian, very Christian. Both of us love to talk about religion. She would always talk about like Christian topics and perspective, and we go into that, and then I would say like, oh yeah, like, well, in Islam this and Islam that, because like Islam was the thing, like the religion I knew the most about. I didn't know too much about Christianity so much. I remember one day we were talking about like, I was like, oh yeah, you know, for a while I was vegan and then I was vegetarian, and then I was like, well, if I'm gonna eat meat, like I'm not gonna have pork, because like pigs in general, like they're so emotionally intelligent. Like that was my logic, and it still is. So I stopped eating pork like before it was like officially Muslim, simply because like ethically it didn't make sense to me. And I was telling her, I was like, oh yeah, and it's interesting because like in Islam you're not supposed to eat pork, obviously, because of like all the insane, crazy like detriments to your health that are like interlaced in pork. Like that's definitely a huge reason, right? That I'm sure like in terms of like Allah's wisdom, but at the same time like, okay, well that makes sense, like not only like the health aspect of it, but like even like the like ethical aspect of it does make sense. And then I was like, that's very interesting. And I think she had asked me something about Islam or like my particular religion or something, I can't remember. We'd send these really cool like voice notes to each other that would be like literally like 30 minutes long. We would say like, we call them podcasts. So we'd have like these spiritual religious podcasts about just like life and psychology and stuff like that. This was right around the start of the pandemic, and I was like, you know, I've looked a lot into Islam and into religion in general, but I've never really looked into Islam in terms of like, is it a me thing? Like, is it a for me thing? You know, just more out of like admiration and like love for the religion because of like how I saw it already, and like, you know, like the people in my life who are Muslim. And so I was like, I wonder if this is like a thing for me. And so yeah, just did more research like online, and I started reading the Quran, and specifically I love the translation that I have. That one just really like clicked with me. And yeah, it was kind of like an overtime. It's like I had all these beliefs, and I was like, oh wow, it's like this is what Islam is, and then this is what like I believe in, like they're the same thing basically. So I was like, interesting. Yeah, that's kind of the story of it, which is super not short. There's a lot more to it, I guess, that I'll probably address at later times. But yeah, TLDR is that saying where if you like walk, he'll run to you. If you move an inch, he'll go a mile. You know, like will reach those he wills. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Super, super, super true. I literally went from being an atheist, like